So hello to my friends and family in America, India, and abroad. This is Sunny Sharma. My podcast is India Inside with Sunny Sharma. My YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Inside Movement. Today I have a special guest. His name is David Meadows. David is he in many ways has been involved in politics for some time. He correct me if I'm wrong, David, or just expound after I detail what you've done. You can introduce yourself more. He was a phone banker for Bernie Sanders. He was the head organizer for the Movement for a People's Party in Georgia. Following this, he worked very extensively to work on petitioning to get Dr. Cornell West to the ballot in Georgia for the 2024 presidential election. Is there anything else you want to include, David?
I think politically, that's probably a good uh, sum of my work, and I would also mention that I regularly organize with Better Ballot Georgia for ranked choice instant runoff voting. That is a group that I'm still very much involved with, and they're doing the good work out there.
Great, wonderful. Um, so really my first question is a question I thought of after hearing some politicians talk about mediating institutions. And it's also a question which I wanted to ask because it relates to both America and India, and it's a topic that I think is very pertinent and relevant and salient to both America and India. So just for some context, in both current American and Indian news, mediating institutions, such as religious organizations, unions, universities, have either taken on an arguably unwarranted influence and dangerous role in politics, such as Christian evangelical nationalism in America or the role of Godmen in India. Um, on the other hand, the intellectual freedom, including free speech of universities and collective bargaining of trade unions, has come under attack in the US, India, and around the globe. So my first question for you, David, which we can discuss, is what should be the role of mediating institutions, universities, religious organizations, trade unions in our current political climate in America and India? Which one should be involved, to what degree, and how should they counter the false narratives of authoritarianism, whether they come from the central government or corporate controlled agencies that desire greater access and influence in the halls of power?
You're jumping straight into the deep end, huh?
Yeah. Sorry, it was a long question. It's a little winded.
No worries. No worries. As far as what role does government have in mediating institutions? And I say outside of government institutions, none. They have no right to mediate what's going on a college campus if no laws are being broken. And you see what's happening is they just make up other fake stories or um, lies about what laws may or may not have been broken. Or in the case of you look at what happened with Mahmoud Khalil, they didn't even make up anything. They didn't even charge him with anything. They said, we don't accuse him of any crimes. It's just we don't like what he's saying. It's against our foreign policy. And the Secretary of State says, hey, we can send him away. Um, I think right now, the only college institution that's actually standing up to this, I think right now, um, and I could be wrong on this. There could be others that aren't making the news, but Harvard has come out strong against allowing governments to sort of mediate free speech on their campus, and um, we could go in a lot of different directions based on what issue specifically, how they mediate. But I think what's on the top of everybody's minds right now is what they're doing to protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters, and trying to call them terrorists, which is an old hat trick. They did that to the Stop Cop City protesters here in Atlanta. They called them terrorists. They tried to pull them up on RICO charges, which is still ongoing. There's going to be a huge um, protest at the Atlanta City Hall, or I know it's actually in the Atlanta City Court when they um, when some of these Stop Cop City protesters come up for their case here in the next couple of days. I think it's about a week or two, actually. But yeah, there are. But a long story short, the short answer to your question: if it's not a government institution, the government has no place mediating it, in my opinion.
Okay. So in terms of mediating institutions, do you think there is a differentiation, and this may be an obvious question, between how religious organizations versus universities versus trade unions should be involved in in shaping culture in American politics?
Do I think that there's a difference in how they should be involved?
Yeah, I just think, yeah.
Well, uh, with churches, let's start with churches first. It's sort of a slippery slope because they're not supposed to get directly involved because they're nonprofit organizations, right? They don't pay taxes, so they can't really go in. Now, that's individual churches. That doesn't mean that a group of people of like-minded faiths decided that, hey, we see what's happening here and it's against what we believe is right and good, so we're going to stand up and speak. And there's places for other organizations, not necessarily the church itself, but other organizations that align these like-minded individuals. When you come to unions, I really think that unions need to be more. I think there's a problem with unions being sucked up into the Democrat Party, um, because one, Democrats don't actually look after the unions; they are only there to solicit their vote. And if you look at what Biden just did in his last in his presidency, he even though he gets a lot of praise, even from people like Bernie Sanders for being our generation's FDR, which is far from it. Um, he you look at what he did to unions. He forced a contract on the railroad workers, passed a law that they had to accept a contract. Now, that's textbook fascism. And that came from, I'm not going to call them the left, but it came from the Democrat Party, and it was bipartisan because the Republicans joined in on that too. And so, what I think that would be beneficial for unions is to not get sucked up in politics per se, but to focus on union solidarity and union issues, fight for the rights of your union members, not for Chuck Schumer or uh, whatever aim, any individual party, or Donald Trump or the Republicans. Any of these organizations shouldn't have control of the unions. The unions should actually be more focused on their workers instead of getting sucked up. That doesn't mean that they can't. I think the person who handled it best in the last election, union wise, was Christian Smalls with the Amazon union. And they invited the candidates to come and speak to their members. All of the candidates, not just um, Trump or Biden or Kamala. They invited Dr. West. They invited Claudia Dela Cruz. They invited Jill Stein. They invited these people to come and speak to their members, but they didn't offer an endorsement so that the members could make up their minds for themselves.
Okay. So speaking to that issue, um, so I remember hearing you in a previous podcast you did with Tracy Carson, where you said that the left was very fragmented, and you said this was an issue. Um, so do you think the left can become a significant force again? Can it become united enough to be a significant force against the Republican Party? Um, and
Go
does the
ahead.
Democratic Party need to still, can the Democratic Party reclaim its position as the party of the working class?
They have no interest in doing so. Could they? Sure, they could, but they have no interest in doing so, and they're not going to, because they welcomed the loss of that demographic. their voting demographic to Donald Trump. They welcomed it. If you listen to Chuck Schumer's like, we can repeat that in Pennsylvania and Ohio. We're just going to lose blue collar workers and we'll take suburban white collar workers. We'll get their votes. And they haven't changed their strategy and they haven't shown any indication that they have a desire to change that strategy. And like I said, look what they did recently with the unions under Biden. They don't care about working people. They care about trying to browbeat them into giving them their votes, not offering them anything, just saying, hey, if you don't vote for us, you know you're racist and sexist and xenophobe and all of these sort of things. Not because anything you said or did, just because you wouldn't vote for us. And so I think with that tactic in of itself, that alienates people. That pushes people away. That even pushes people who are Black, queer, and Hispanic away from the Democrat Party because look, even Donald Trump has gained those voters who have left the Democratic Party because they can tell that the Democrats have no interest in governing on their behalf, doing something for the working people and for the people in marginalized communities. Now, I'm not saying that the Republicans do. Of course, they do not. They're running the same game, but they're not ashamed of pandering to working people. Democrats seem to be. And as far as the fracturing, what will help the Democrats, or I'm sorry, not the Democrats, what will help the left to unify is leaving the Democrat Party. You have to, because that's a graveyard. Nothing you plan to do from a populist or perspective point is going to be achieved through the Democrat Party. So it's a waste of time. It's a waste of organizing energy. So there needs to be an issue that people can coalesce around. You know, in 2016 and 2020, that was about universal health care. That was a galvanizing issue for the left. And I think issues like that. And in 2024, I think the galvanizing issue was genocide. And the Democrats just turned a deaf ear to it. They said, yeah, we know you don't like it, but oh, well, we're happy to lose on that point and give Donald Trump the presidency. We won't stop a genocide to win an office. So if there's any hope of the left actually coalescing and coming together, unifying out of these fractured different forms, they have to come out from under the wing of the Democrats. It's not going to be DSA likely. It's not going to be working families parties because these are all captured by the Democrat Party. It's going to have to be either an independent or an extra duopoly party that emerges with a populist message, something that the people are actually interested in, and gets fire under them to work and to organize and to bring forward actual candidates and policies that are pro actual left-leaning ideas.
It's interesting you say that because I was unaware that, you said that the ethnic cleansing was a galvanizing issue. And I've read a little bit about the history of America, particularly the Civil War. And slavery was, I believe, a galvanizing issue back then. Although it's more complicated than that. There are many parties. What do you think is I wrote this down. What are two things, there might be one thing, two thing, three things that people most misunderstand about the political process or political parties?
I think that the thing that most people get lost in the sauce about, so to speak, is the fact that when you're talking about the major parties, that there is really no difference. They think that I'm on team D, team blue, rah, 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 or I'm on team red, team Republican, rah, rah, rah. And they think that they've drawn their lines and that they're on a solid side without taking into account that it's a one-party system. We only have one party. It appears like two. And even Barack Obama recently said, not recently, but when he was president, He said that if you look at my policies, they'd be a 1980s centrist Republican. There's a very small window of debate about policies here in this country because we want to keep things generally focused on social issues. We don't really want to focus on other policies, foreign policy, workers' rights, uh, etc. What we're focusing on are social issues because that's the easiest divider. If we focus on social issues, we can divide people up and it's easier to conquer them and set them off in different little groups so that they have no collective power.
So Noam Chomsky mentioned that too. If you're, are you familiar with Chomsky? Chomsky said that the Republican Party can no longer organize around real issues, that they can only organize around social and cultural issues. Um, but if that's the case, why do you think still the Democratic Party cannot challenge them in the near future? Or
I really believe that the Democrat Party is. I think that the veil has slipped, and I think that more people than ever have seen what the party really is. And that is the only real explanation for why Donald Trump won. Is because everybody sees how fake and empty the Democrats are, and they're not going to do any of the things that they say that they're going to do for working people. So they don't hear those promises. That's why Donald Trump won uh, the popular vote, not just the electoral college, but the popular vote. Is that enough Americans are either so completely disillusioned with Democrats that they're completely dropped out of the system, or they've moved to other areas for their organizing. They've moved to the Green Party, they've moved to the Libertarians, um, and unfortunately, I have to quote Charlemagne, who called it. I'm afraid the couch is going to win, and the couch won. More people than ever just didn't vote this past election. Why is that? Well, I think that could be. You look at what the Democrat Party did to us in Georgia at the Cornell West campaign, and the fact that the party would willing to be doing something like that to genuine organizers. Well, I mean that's case proof positive that they don't really care about democracy. They beat their chests about democracy, but they want to rob people of their enfranchised votes. They don't want their votes to be counted. So, how are you for democracy? Explain that to me again. So, I think that could they? Yes, they could, but will they is the real question. The question is, will they? Will they come up with an actual populist? Now, you got groups like the Young Turks. Cenk Uygur is talking about a populist takeover of the Democratic Party, which sounds good in theory, right? But we've played this game before, have we not? Isn't that what the Justice Democrats were? That Cenk Uygur also founded and then was promptly lost control of, which he will do with this as well, so that he doesn't have to take any responsibility for where this group eventually goes. Whatever these populist Democrats that he's going to try and put forward to run in primary, and even you see David Hogg, the vice chair of the Democrat Party. This is showroom stuff. This is not. He's talking about wanting to primary Democrats, but David Hogg is almost a one-issue person. He only talks about gun violence. It's a valid issue. I'm not saying people shouldn't talk about gun violence, but I haven't heard him wax philosophical on any other issue except for gun violence. And I think that him and characters like Cenk Uygur, they're putting forward this and AOC and Bernie Sanders with their Fight the Oligarchy tour. They're trying to usher energy back to the Democrat Party because the Democrats know what the score is. They know that the only way they can survive in the future and have people continue to take them seriously as a political party is if they try to usher this energy back in, because there's a lot of people who are frustrated with the party. Problem is they're not going to change. And these characters like Cenk Uygur, David Hogg, AOC, and Bernie Sanders, they will either be co-opted, their messages will be co-opted, and they'll lose sizzle. Like they used to talk about Medicare for all, universal health care, and then they started changing and talking about, even AOC started talking about affordable health care They stopped talking about universal health care and they changed their message to affordable health care. You'll see that they'll change their message as we move closer to 26 or 2028. They'll change their message. It's called the pivot. They pivot further to the right because they think that's the only way to win. Instead of saying, hey, there's a whole bunch of people out there in this country who don't consider themselves left. They don't consider themselves right. They're just working people trying to scrap and make ends meet and try to, get their bread for the day, right? So what options are you offering them? What policies are you offering the working people in the country? And their argument and their self-reflection has been, maybe we just need to go a little further to the right. And that's always the Democrats' response. It's about closing that Overton window. Democrats exist to keep any movement moving further to the left, right? And I know that looks like I'm pointing right, but cameras and mirrors and whatnot. But that's what Democrats exist for, is to keep movement from going to the left, whereas the Republicans constantly move to the right, right? And that drags the Democrats with them, especially since 92 with Bill Clinton's third wave Democrats. They're just tagging along on the Republican overall tails and just moving further and further to the right with them. And that's still their diagnosis, their self-diagnosis about why they lost. Has nothing to do in their mind with the fact that, they forced a contract on people through Congress. They didn't have a real primary. They had a closed convention with a process, not an actual election as to who's going to be the candidate. And it was solely based on identity and performative gestures and identity politics that didn't really translate to helping anybody. It's just, more rah-rah cheerleading. It's not any actual effective change.
So from what I'm hearing, I think there is a gap to where a third party can really occupy that space. And from your experience, working for the People's Party, working to petition Dr. Cornell West, do you believe there's a place for a third party to come into place? And if so, you talk about this idea of galvanizing over an issue or over a candidate. Do you think we can what do you think we have to galvanize behind? Does it have to be a third party? Can we galvanize behind a particular candidate? Does it have to be the right candidate? Does it have to be the right issue or issues? What do you think? Are there multiple things we have to take into account?
There are many factors to that, but two things I would say. One is we got to move away from this concept of third party, because that's a psyop, just the word third party. Because if you look at it effectively, there are four major parties in this country. When we get into America, there are four major parties in this country. If you go by the metrics of ballot access, who regularly gains ballot access and you can actually vote for. So there are four of those if you count the Green and Libertarian parties, right? So why are we still saying third party? It's because we don't even want people to consider those. And they want us to continue saying third party. Whatever we may want to say, whether we want to say the duopoly or extra duopoly or an independent party, we sort of want to move away from that because it's sort of a self-defeating frame of mind, is to concentrate and think about third party. Now, as far as a candidate, I think something we need to learn, and this is something that I've had to learn over, supporting Bernie Sanders and supporting Dr. West, both very intelligent, very strong-willed individuals who were able to build movements. But what I've learned is and I'm not saying that I idolize them, but don't have idols. Like no one person is going to save us. So we can't, we may end up with a dream candidate, but the only way we end up with that dream candidate is that candidate is on the right issues. And we need to not vote for parties. really not even vote for candidates at this point. We got to vote for issues. We got to vote for who's behind the right issue, and do they have the gravitas and the sincerity? Do we believe what they're saying? Because a lot of people can come up and say a lot of flowery language, but most people have a pretty squeegee third eye or a BS detector, and know them when people are talking that they're just blowing hot air and not actually thinking about any real organizing. Let's see.
I think, I don't know if you're familiar with Eugene Debs, but Eugene Debs, the socialist organizer, he famously said, I wouldn't lead you into the promised land because someone would lead you out. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so
That's so true.
you mentioned the use of language, like third party. And I think when I was with you with the People's Party, Ralph Nader had given us some advice. And so my next question is based upon the advice Ralph Nader gave. And um, why do you think he was so particular about the language we choose to use? Because he talked a lot about language and how language affects how people perceive um, or particular political parties, such as the language of the left or of I mean, etc. I don't remember his specific examples, but
I think the thing that stands out in my mind from when Ralph was talking to us, um, huge admirer of Mr. Nader. I think what he did in 2000, and even before then, like before he got into politics, I mean, like we've got safety belts because of Ralph Nader. He's a remarkable person. I think that his insight is still valuable, and on some level, he may be working with the the temperament of the populace at the time that he was running. But I think the biggest piece of advice that he was offering to us is we shouldn't we should stay away from certain buzzwords like calling out the capitalists, right? You don't have to call them capitalists, because if you call them capitalists, then everybody's automatically, oh well, you must be a communist, and then their hair is all raised up because you appear to be a communist, even though most people can't even tell you what a communist is. But if you talk about capitalists, people are going to call you a communist or a socialist, which I know that a lot of people who consider themselves on the left are worried about being called that. Like the Republicans are going to call us socialists, like they're going to call you that anyway. It doesn't matter. They're always going to call you that. So you got to move away from that. Now, what Ralph's advice was to say, corporatists, talk about corporatism. And I mean, and now Bernie's using oligarchy, which I found interesting because he just helped an oligarchic administration the last 4 years, told everybody that he was RFK, refused to endorse anyone that ran against him, and endorsed him, and basically stopped anyone from really trying to push him right by saying, "Oh, he's doing a good job. My friend Joe Biden, my friend." And so I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I'm a little lost in my ramble there. But repeat the question again. I apologize.
so why do you think Ralph Nader was so particular about the
Oh,
language we use?
yeah, language is very important, and it affects how people think about things because people are so propagandized, and language is used to propagandize people. So you got to find ways around that. So, like I was saying, he said he didn't want us to be using words like capitalists, talk about corporatists, just to keep them from to avoid scaring people off with these buzzwords that they've been programmed and propagandized into mistrusting. Sorry, yeah, that did sort of wrap that up, I think.
So this is kind of an oddball question, but I was reading an article about trade unions, and today much less of the American labor force is unionized as it used to be. And I think gradually that is actually changing, right? I think more people are unionizing. Um,
Slowly, a lot of people are trying. Yeah.
yeah, so so why do you think this is kind of a more international question, but I read somewhere that authoritarian governments, when they come to power, the first organizations they start to target are trade unions. Do you know? So why do you think that is the case? Why do you think unions would be the first? Uh,
Because what unions are supposed to be, not necessarily what they are, but what they're supposed to be, is a way for the working class to wield power. They use their labor as their leverage. Like, you want our labor? Well, we want these demands. And labor is important. I mean, the people who would be in labor unions, the people who work in the industries that labor unions represent, are the people who actually run this country. I mean, like, keep the wheels going and keep the momentum. I'm not saying like they make the heavy decisions. The oligarchs and the bosses do that, but the unions and the workers specifically, they're the ones that make sure the trains run on time. They make sure that the trash is collected. They make sure that the waterworks are operating. They make sure that the electricity is working. Right. So these are the fundamental aspects of a modern society. These services that we provide for ourselves, trash collection, power, water, etc. Without that sector and without control of that sector, the workers, then they could decide, well, we're going to strike and we're not going to do this until our demands are met. And if they hold that leverage and that power, then they can see change made. They really can. And so you see cases like, I think it's timely with what's going on. But if you look at Ukraine, I know everybody currently doesn't like the fact that Donald Trump badmouthed Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. I really don't think he badmouthed him. He said, "You can't tell us what we're going to feel," and I actually kind of agree with that sentiment. But what you got to consider about Zelensky is uh, he is a dictator. His term ended in last May. He's gonna this next month. He will have been a dictator for a year because his term was up and he didn't have an election. Why? Well, we're at war. That's very convenient. We had elections in this country during the Civil War, during World War I, during World War II. We had elections in this country, but because of a law that was placed into the Civil Code of Ukraine, and get this, 2015, the year after we couped them, because that law was added to make sure that the war could go on as long as possible, as long as we had a willing puppet in the administration that's running Ukraine. They can't get them out because we made sure that they inserted a law that during war, it's martial law, no elections. We made that decision for them. They obliged. And now Ukraine is in a situation where I know the majority of Ukrainians, and this is based on actual polling, would prefer an expedient negotiated end to the war rather than the war continuing. But it seems that both sides, and Zelensky somewhat as being stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're the rock. The U.S. foreign policy is the rock, and the right-wing extremist neo-Nazis in Ukraine are the hard place. And Zelensky's stuck between them because he came to power asking for peace, but these two powers that are keeping him in power, giving him the funding and the weaponry to continue the war, and the people who are actually out there fighting it, the extremists, the ones that are dragging citizens off the street and throwing them in vans to be pushed to the front line, those types of neo-Nazis, and I shouldn't even say neo, they're just Nazis. They're proclaiming their birthright. They are children and grandchildren of actual Nazi collaborators. So let's drop the neo and just call a spade a spade. they are Nazis. And that's where Zelensky is. He's between US foreign policy, which is destroying his country, and neo Nazis, who are also destroying their country, but they think that it's for them, it's so they can have the country for themselves. Sorry, it's a mouthful.
No, no, that's all right. That was a very good response. So democracy seems to be receding around the globe. You're seeing authoritarian governments take power all over the world. And Europe was kind of a bastion for a lot of democracy. And I think the reason why Europe for a long time had constitutional republics and democracies was because after World War II, America helped them recover, and they it was a hard fought battle to have democracy in Europe because Europe had been at war for centuries. Um, so what do you think? I don't know what question to ask, but so another question. Do you think
Can
America?
democracy make a comeback?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I don't know what to ask, but do you think America was ever great again? When they say "Make America Great Again," I've been listening to some economists talk about this, and they say under FDR's leadership in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was FDR had put in place an economic framework that had for basically 2 to 3 decades had or a quarter of a century had stopped any major depressions from happening. And eventually that economic framework was dismantled after the New Left movement. The New Left movement led by people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and other people. Um, so my question really is, can we return to that? I'm unsure whether we can return to that era because during that era there was a much I mean, I don't know if you agree with me, there was a much higher marginal tax rate, much higher, especially on the rich. But I'm doubtful that our politicians, especially our leaders, especially the ones who are in power now, will ever want us to return to that system, especially given what you've told me about the Democratic Party. The Republican Party certainly does not want to return to that. I mean, they're a party of um, you know, they're a party of cutting taxes for the rich. But so is there any hope that the Democratic Party can, or a new party can return us to an era when there was a much higher degree of prosperity and there was an economic framework in place, a framework which, I mean, arguably Barack Obama during the recession in America, he did bring back a lot of those, like the Dodd-Frank Act, the Reinvestment Act. He did put a stimulus in place to recover a lot of jobs and to put consumer protection laws in place. Um, but I'm unsure whether the Democratic Party can ever help us return to that era of prosperity that we had, which also was an era when the unionization was much higher. Um,
Yeah. Make America great again. Now, America has done some great things. Put a man on the moon, right? Um, we had who was it? Lindbergh circumnavigated the globe. American. We invented rock and roll. America is great. There are other things in our past, though, that are not so great. Can we reach the greatness of the past that we had? We have to acknowledge those places where we were not great and be better than that. We have to acknowledge Jim Crow. We have to acknowledge slavery. We have to acknowledge Japanese internment. We have to acknowledge these points where America was not so great and make a future where we don't fall into those. And we would need a higher tax rate for the wealthiest people to make America great in the economic way that you're talking about. It would require that. And it would require, honestly, I think, for lack of a better phrase, a come to Jesus moment of the oligarchs of the billionaires and the uber wealthy to realize, oh, wait, we're in this with them. We're all in this together. If I want educated staff, if I want a good workforce, I should want a thriving education system in my community, a thriving education system, not a bare bones. Okay, well, we taught them how to count to 10 in their ABCs. There you go. Now go off to the mines. I'm talking about a thriving education system. So we would need that. Can a third party? We've already established. I don't think the Democrats have the stomach for it. They don't want to do it. They don't want to see any actual common goals with the working class people because their job is to extract wealth. And this is not just the Democrats; that's the Republicans as well. The current administration and the administration before, their jobs were to extract wealth from the working class, from the tax base, and move that wealth up to the people who are already rich. That's the outcome of COVID. That happened with COVID because of the economic situation that happened there. Look at what 40% of Black businesses shuttered because of COVID, and all the money and wealth that should have gone to these sectors, they were boosted and they were taken straight out of the tax base and given to Walmart, Target, Amazon, all these places they were necessities and they needed extra funding. And they got extra funding. They got loans that were forgiven. They didn't even have to pay back. So maybe if we have a party or a political movement that actually focuses on the worker and focuses on the people, yeah, we can get back to something great here in this country. There's still some great things going on in this country still now. Not everything, of course. We have to identify what the things that make us less great are, and really meditate on that and get out of some old cycles. It's some broad language, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so you mentioned, I mean, something which I agree with about educating our citizens. I was reading a comment someone made on a YouTube video, and he said, you know, our Constitution should have in it a phrase that says basically, we need a very educated citizenry. And that really stuck out to me. There are many other things he said, but that for one thing really stuck out to me because I think, I think education is probably the greatest defense against any authoritarianism or any curtailment of freedoms. Um, so my next question, so America really, it's surprising it's already happened, but by next year, July, America will have reached its 250th anniversary as a nation, as a constitutional republic. Um, so do you think there's certain things that have to be emphasized in order to preserve democracy in America? The examples I used, I just said educated citizenry, um, ending the unfair electoral college. Um, I also put reinvigorating spiritual principles in government. I don't know if you agree with that, but um,
I mean, I do. You're going to have some people who don't necessarily, just because they're so turned off by religion in general and spirituality in general. But I think that, and I think that the founders, while not identifying a specific entity or deity, they use a very generic word, just saying God. They include them. The founders include God in the. Sorry about that. I had a old alarm set. Anyway, it depends on what these principles are. Like if we're talking about, like a separated or an apartheid system for believers and non-believers, no, of course not. If we're talking about a caste system, I don't agree with that either. We're talking about these types of religious aspects and ideals. They don't really help churn democracy. They really don't inspire democracy. But um, if you look at some of the things that Jesus actually said, he sounds a lot like a socialist. So if we start looking at some of those things that Jesus said that was talking about, you know, take care of the poor, take care of the sick, take care of the widows, take care of the orphans, this kind of stuff, like take care of people. Because guess what? They're you. And but for the grace of God go I. That means that you could be in that situation too. And the only actual salvation is a community that knows that their job is to act on behalf of whatever their belief system entails. If you see somebody who's hungry, you see somebody who doesn't have food or clothes or a place to stay, your job is to, as a believer, speaking from a Christian perspective, but I also know that there's codes of conduct in just about every religion for this, that you're supposed to help the less fortunate. You're not supposed to, well, I got mine, they're just on their own. That's not the attitude that any of our enlightened spiritual leaders would want. But I think that what is missed is, as a Christian, I do believe that we're involved in spiritual warfare, even on a political level. Um, and if we acknowledge that, but we don't try and make a holy war out of it, because I think that would be a mistake as well, um, it'll be easier to identify what the negative um, causes or influences are in our government. And I think the number one negative, immoral influence in our government, in our world, in our economy, it's greed. And observing that and acknowledging that, that's a spiritual concept. I mean, it's one of the seven deadly sins, greed, right? So if we talk about greed as a real thing that affects real people, some people may think that that's going a little over the line. We're talking about spiritual stuff. We're talking about something that actually directly affects everybody, because everybody is affected by greed. So I think that there's a place for that, and definitely there's a place in every individual's heart for their own spirituality. Um, and I think that what people are afraid of, and I think that some people were afraid of Dr. West as a religious or spiritual person and vying for a position of power, and they want to go to, well, separation of church and state. And I think that people lose sight of what separation of church and state really is. It's that the government will neither create a state religion or make a law concerning how other people can worship. That's the separation of church and state. Not like you can't make a law based on your spiritual beliefs. That's not necessarily true. Some people made a law on spiritual beliefs. They said that thou shalt not kill. Murder one is a law that's rooted in that. Um, and I'm sure other traditions as well, but you see that there's a confluence here between the spiritual and the corporeal, the physical, and there's a balance to be struck there, of course. But that doesn't mean we can't have religion. We can't have anyone who professes a religion, who professes some spiritual concept, that they have to be moved out of the public space. I think that's a mistake. But like I said, you got to strike the balance.
Yeah. So this goes back to my first question. Uh what do you think of people, a lot of people are talking about Christian nationalism and how I don't think Trump is a Christian nationalist, but how potentially Christian nationalism could erode democratic principles in government. And I think particularly they're looking at the influence that evangelical Christians have. They have an immense influence in our government. And a lot of their policy does actually, um, a lot of it is centered around Israel. I mean, that's one of the big things they're supporting. Um, Do you think there's a like, and I feel like they somewhat detract from the good elements of the church, because the church, this is a question I didn't ask, but historically the church was involved in abolitionism. It was involved in the civil rights movement. But today we don't see as big a scope or influence of the church in politics. And perhaps that's, it depends who you're asking though. The evangelicals, they certainly have a big influence, but the more so, I mean, there are lots of different denominations, but um, I was just wondering whether you think Christian nationalism could be dangerous from an evangelical perspective, and whether other denominations of the church potentially could contribute to democratic principles, at least from a standpoint of moral authority or social justice or strategy. Because Dr. King, if we look at Dr. King, he was a public policy expert, I believe, and he was a very good social reformer. I mean, he was involved in the Poor People's Campaign, which we talked about when we were in the People's Party. Um, so I'm really wondering whether other religious organizations, especially the church, could potentially reclaim their social justice function in American society. Um, what do you think about that? Do you think it will take a particular leader or particular message? Because that movement was about segregation. But Dr. King also made it about a lot of other things, racism, poverty, militarism. So he kind of galvanized people around a lot of issues. Do you think there's something that we have to do similar today, or do you think the church should not be involved in politics at all?
Um, well, it's a difficult situation. First of all, a short yes or no. Is Christian nationalism dangerous? Yes. Christian nationalism is absolutely dangerous. Um, when they say that, they think they're just saying that they're patriots. And what you actually have is a lot of people who are uneducated in the scriptures they pretend to believe in. I didn't say pretend, I said portend. They believe that they believe in it. And they're trying, they think that they're doing the right thing. But a lot of this is just how they grew up. That's the tradition they grew up in. Uh, and unfortunately, too many people behind pulpits who aren't actually preaching the word of God, they are preaching prosperity gospel. God wants you to be rich. God wants all the best things for you, which there's very little actual um, founding for in the scriptures. You go back to what Jesus actually said about wealth. He said it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. That doesn't sound like prosperity gospel to me. And I don't think to anyone who's heard prosperity gospel would recognize that as part of prosperity gospel. So we know Jesus didn't actually preach prosperity gospel. And these people call themselves Christians. So can there be a positive move for Christian people in the political realm? Yes, as individuals and with a moral revival to bring people back to the moral fundamentals. And I'm not talking about fundamentalism, but the moral fundamentals, as in love your neighbor as you love yourself. All right. And that's something that you don't hear a lot of people preaching behind a pulpit these days. You don't hear peace, hope, and love preached. You hear hate, greed, and prosperity. That's what you hear preached behind these pulpits a lot these days. It would take a great moral revival. It would be a movement, not any one individual, a confluence of congregations, groups, movements coming together. Like I said, we're all fractured. If we all come together, we can come together making a larger thing. Um,
Yeah,
and
I know William Barber, the Poor People's Campaign leader. He's trying to reinvigorate morality a lot into. He's not the only one. There are some politicians who, I mean, they have
I
more.
have a great respect for the Poor People's Campaign as it exists today under Bishop Barber. My issue is that they're still too captured by the Democrat Party because they wanted to support Kamala. Well, Kamala was carrying out a genocide. She wasn't just no one, she was the vice president who was saying that there's no light between me and Joe Biden on this. We are in lockstep. I'm not changing any policies. When she's asked about it, she says, I'm not changing anything. So why would you support that? Well, I mean, the simple answer to most people is, well, the alternative is Trump. Like, well, there are other alternatives, but the mass media doesn't want you to know about that.
Hmm. Yeah. So, next.
Although I know Barber knew about Dr. West's campaign, but I never heard him speak about it.
Yeah, Dr. Cornell West also talked at the Poor People's Campaign, moral, what is it called? Moral March on
Mhm.
Washington. He talked there. Um, but yeah, I think there are a number of people in the Democratic Party who aren't as um genuine about their efforts to end poverty in this country. Um, so speaking of, because you were talking about poverty, um, is there any way for any particular emerging party or either the Democrats or Republicans to make the elimination of poverty a serious public policy issue? Why has no party taken on that mission? Do you think do you think it has to do with their just how they're structured or their corporate donors or
It is the corporate donors, 100%, because they can't stay wealthy, or at least not the same level of wealthy as they are now, if we actually target poverty. Because the resources that they've been sucking up from the working people and taking away all the subsidies that these large corporations who are already rich and have a lot of money, that where the government could use that money to bolster education, give free health care, give training and job training courses, and get people working and making money. Um, we could do that, but they might be a little less rich, the corporate donors. So the corporate donors don't have any interest in that. They want to become more rich because it's not enough. It's never enough. It will never be enough because their God is mammon. They worship they worship money. They do. And you can tell by their deeds what they do. You can tell that they worship money because what they're doing always has the outcome of them making more money. That's their God, and it would take them getting rid of their corporate. Here's something I wanted to point out. You notice how Ossoff, because he's gearing up for a Senate campaign against Kemp. You know what his big issue is right now that he talks a lot about?
no, don't.
He's a little mealy mouthed about Israel. He's not completely, even though he's getting a lot of pushback just because he's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be pushing a genocide. He's not even fully committed to stopping the war, but because he says maybe they shouldn't be targeting women and children, he's getting pushback for that. And that's all you really got to say to be a radical these days. Maybe we shouldn't be killing women and children. Um, but his big issue is insider trading inside Congress, right? Because you have all these, Nancy Pelosi is probably the best example. You have all these elected officials making decisions on how businesses can run in Congress because they're passing laws. They know the outcome, so they know how the market will be affected, and they're able to trade accordingly at their benefit, making millions and millions of dollars. What did Truman say? Um, if you left government rich, you're a crook. Only crooks leave government rich, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm like, because there's not really money in working in the government, but you can find these little nooks and crannies of ways to make your money. And so that's his huge thing is we don't need to be doing insider trading. I've got my stuff in a blind trust, which means that your broker is paying attention to what you're doing and making trades for you accordingly, which is ultimately the same thing. You know what I'd like to see him focusing on instead of insider trading? And I'll tell you this, I'm not a fan of insider trading. I think it's kind of sad that the only person, even though it's against the law, the only person who really is doing time for it is people like Bernie Madoff and um, who was it? The chick who's friends with Snoop Dogg, the Home Goods type. You know what I'm talking about?
Who is she? Where is she? What channel does she appear on?
I don't know. She's all over the place. Uh, anyway, she's a homemaker, famous homemaker. Um, has her own magazine, stuff like that. Like she's like a Oprah level type of uh, mover and shaker. And she did some insider trading and had to do some time. And then she became friends with Snoop Dogg and was like, "Yeah, we're on that, G." And uh, what I would like to see instead of this fight against insider trading is publicly funded elections. If Ossoff said was more concerned about being bought off by his donors and said we need to stop these donors buying us off so we can actually vote according to our conscience and according to our constituents and what they really want. Um, that would be a wildly more drastic and a bigger punch in the face of corruption than insider trading. But if all you want to do is stop the insider trading, fine. But you want to let the corporations have control of the government through you, you're fine with that. We see. That's why I don't think he should be elected again. But um, it's kind of a hard situation because then who else is it going to be? Kemp?
So,
As a matter of fact, if you don't mind me saying, you remember we protested outside of John Ossoff's office with Black Voters Matter because he wouldn't consider going against the parliamentarian for voting rights. He's saying, well, these voting rights, we don't have enough votes, but they did have the votes because it actually didn't have anything to do with funding. And he was hiding behind the parliamentarian on that and wouldn't stand up for voting rights and he wouldn't pack the court or he wouldn't do this. He's not for universal health care. He's really not on the left. And I don't see why people just applaud him as a left character. And his big move is we need to stop insider trading. But corporations can still own me and run the government through me.
um, yeah. I mean, I voted for Ossoff, but I don't know if
I
you.
did too.
Yeah, I voted for
I,
him, but
I didn't see any other option at the time. I don't know if I will this time though.
yeah, I mean, the other option I don't think is very good, but
Well, that's where it's incumbent upon us to find that better option
right, right. So
as voters.
do you think there's any way, this is kind of an idealistic question. Um, how can there be a mutual benefit between the rich and the poor? Is there any way for there to be a mutual understanding? Because from what I've heard that the more money rich people have, I'm not saying I'm not going to draw a blanket generalization over every rich person, but many rich people, the more assets they have, the more assets they're going to accrue and accrue and accrue over time. And that eventually, as many economists in the past have said, will lead to more and more poor people. That it's something the term they use is the immiseration of the proletariat. This is something I know people don't like socialism, but Karl Marx talked about this, and many economists talked about the immiseration of the proletariat. But there are many people such as I mean, for lack of better examples, Dr. King, Mahatma Gandhi, who talked about trusteeships. You know what a trustee is? Kind of like having communities where rich people can be the benefactors for groups of poor people so that they can support them until they have the resources to pay for their own housing. Um, so that's kind of an idea where there's kind of a connection between rich and poor people. So, but going back to it, is there any way, do you know any strategies to where there can be a system where there is a mutual beneficial system between rich and poor? Do you think?
Well, Personally, I think that those taxes that you were talking about earlier, the expanded income tax or the graduated tax rate, that is something that actually helped because you can't trust these people to say, okay, I'm going, because they're not gonna, they're greedy. They don't want to give up any of their money if it's not going to benefit them directly, directly, because it does benefit them to help people have housing. Because guess what? Then you don't have to walk over people homeless in the streets. Look at what happened in California. They put $4 million aside, or 40, I'm sorry, $40 million aside for homelessness in California. They actually took this money. They said, we passed a bill. We're going to put $40 million towards ending the homelessness situation in the state of California. You know how much economists think that it would cost to fix the whole country, to give housing to people across the country? About 20 mil. They doubled down on that for one state. Have they fixed their homelessness situation?
No. Well,
No.
there's some argument people make that I've heard. I don't know. I probably shouldn't say his name, but but there was a person who said that most homeless people choose to be homeless.
Oh, I'm not going to put a percentage on that, but I personally know people who have chosen to be homeless because they don't want to be stuck in this rat race of a system that we live in now. I knew a man who came to our church. He stayed on the grounds of the church. He didn't stay inside. We didn't have bedding or stuff like that. It was a small church, but he helped keep up the graveyard, did some light and maintenance around the church, and he would attend services with us. And people would say, "You can come stay with us, or we'll put you up in a hotel. We want you to have accommodations." He didn't want that. He didn't want to be a burden on anyone, and he wanted to live in nature. He wanted to sleep outside in the grass under the stars. That was his desire. Um, that's not really something we should apply to an entire population because look, I'm very close to being homeless right now. I don't have I don't have a lease anywhere. The place where I'm staying, um, they've got the house on the market. I'm about to have no place to be. It's not my choice, but I may very well end up on the streets of Atlanta. It's a possibility. Hopefully, it's not likely. Hopefully, that doesn't happen with me, but it's happened for a lot of people, and there ain't no reason it couldn't happen to me. It's just by the grace of God. If I find somebody who's willing to be a benefactor towards me to help me out, or if, and this is me working a full-time job, mind you. It's not like I'm some layabout. I work 40 hours a week on top of the organizing I do. So this is actual working class people just can't afford to live in the state of Georgia anymore. I may have to leave the state. It may come to that. Either I live on the streets or I'm living out of state. I got to leave the state where I was born because I can't afford to live here. And that's how bad things are getting. And so, even if there are a marginal number of people who do choose to live without the strings of a mortgage and light bills and water bills and power bills and all this shit, excuse my French, there are people who do choose to live like that, but not everyone, by sure, not everyone. And I think that if and I think they figured this out in Utah and in Mississippi of all places, is the way you fix homelessness is you give people homes. You put them in homes. Put them in homes. You don't put any pre requisition to this. It's just give them a home. If they wash out, they wash out of the program. That's on them. But you got to give them an opportunity. You got to give them an opportunity to actually have a place to be. And the people who want to take advantage of that will. In Atlanta, there's one shelter. There's one homeless shelter in the city of Atlanta now because they closed the other ones because they would prefer them to be out on the street. Why? To keep you and me scared because that could be us. Homeless people exist and they don't want to fix the situation to keep you and me in line.
Wow. Yeah, so yeah, when I was so that when I was I was working for Beloved Community Incorporated. Well, I wasn't working, but I volunteered for this organization. Um, and it was very briefly. It was only for a couple months, but it was really to look into the homeless issue. Um, and what I found is that there are a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get people housing, But um, so we've been talking for over an hour, but my last question really, which is an obvious question, but um, so we see AOC and Bernie Sanders traveling the country with their oligarchy rally, but in many ways, do you think it's not a legitimate rally for poor people in the working class? But my question is, I don't know if I have the right question, but what really can make a legitimate grassroots movement to finally challenge, poverty, militarism, and the fundamental issues of our society? Um, and why can this not come from the top down, or can it come from the top down? Do you think we need people in political positions to have fundamental reforms in our society? Or do you think it can all be done from the grassroots, or do we need a combination of grassroots grassroots reform and political power to eventually I think you froze.
You there, Sonny?
Yeah, I think you froze.
Okay, excellent. All right, I'm glad we're back on.
Yeah.
Sorry, my computer's about to die.
Okay. Well, I have my last question, then
My
we'll be
charger
done.
up there.
Last
All
question,
right,
then
so
I'll be done.
last question.
So I'll just repeat it. Do you think do you think we can have reforms in our society through a grassroots movement, or do we necessarily need politicians in power in order to foster change?
It's without a revolution, yes, we need both, an inside outside game. We need a grassroots movement to push the politicians to do what we want them to do because they're not going to do it on their own because we haven't gotten rid of the corporate oligarchs who actually own them. So we have to make them uh, feel that it is in their best interest to do what's right by us. It's got to be an inside outside game. When we talk about what's going on with Bernie and AOC, what are they actually asking people to do?
What are they asking?
Fight the oligarchy, right? Are they
Yeah.
laying down a plan for that? Are they saying how that looks? How we do that? How do we fight the oligarchy? Because the only way we can really fight the oligarchy is get politicians on our side. Well, either through a revolution, and they're not advocating for a revolution. He's even stopped calling for political revolution. That's how he used to start every. Are you ready for political revolution? We were very ready, weren't we? He did not lead us there. We have to lead ourselves there. If I mean, it looks really good. It makes great press what he and AOC are doing right now, but they're not actually doing anything. They're just saying some nice flowery words in Republican controlled areas. I mean, these are places that voted for Biden, but then voted for Trump. That's where they're going to go. They're not going to swing states necessarily. They're not going to places with where their base would be. I mean, they're collecting a lot of people that show up to this, but that's not what they're really looking for. They're looking for a fight against the oligarchy. Well, that takes either a real revolution or a grassroots movement that lights a fire under some politicians to actually make some changes because they're scared of either losing their seat or whatever power they think they hold.
Okay.
And
So,
I don't think that AOC or Bernie are doing either of those things, really.
okay. So we basically have to do what APAC is doing, but in reverse. So they primary anyone who doesn't agree with their lobby, and we primary anyone who doesn't agree with the people's.
Well, what we do is we do primary them, yes, um, but we don't buy them the way APAC buys their. We need to find people who are really sold out to the cause, because if you're really sold out to the cause, you're not going to be sold out to the donors. You see what I'm saying? People who actually really have a conscience. But even with APAC, I mean, look what they did to Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. They don't care if you're Democrat. If you say something negative against them, and this should be why, and everybody in the Democrat Party really seems to not have much of a problem with it. I haven't heard anyone in leadership say, I'm upset that this foreign funding apparatus kicked out two of our bright new stars, parts of the squad. And it was just by dumping money into their races. The candidates that beat them out on their primaries, they're not very good candidates, but they had more money because APAC gave them more money. So we don't have the money. We're not going to have people flood our races with money. So what we need is a tried and true grassroots movement who believes in what they're doing, and candidates that are part of that grassroots movement, that are not going to get bought out and do whatever the corporations or whatever the big money donors want them to do instead, because they are sold out on the cause, on the real issues, not sold out to the donors.
Yeah, so historically speaking, I'm not sure if this is exactly true, but the most successful candidates historically have, I'm not sure the most successful, but very successful were candidates who had a lot of money to begin with. Other than Bernie, Bernie kind of demonstrated that you can have a grassroots campaign and really shake up a lot of the status quo. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I think Bernie also demonstrated that a candidate can win by grassroots donation, which is, but that's for Washington. Of course, we have to also consider local elections as well. Um, but so okay, so last question. We've been talking for some time, but are there any books you recommend about politics that do you think people should read? One or two books.
I think the most important book anyone in politics should read is Smedley Butler's War is a Racket. And if you want to, I really enjoyed going into, I don't have anything like, okay, here's something I do want to read. I'm going to give you three. Two that are serious and one that's kind of funny. So Smedley Butler, um, War is a Racket, is very important. I think anyone on the left, that should be ground one, basic building blocks of your political education, is War is a Racket, because it is. And you see how long this farce has been laid upon us. Then you have The Radical King by Dr. Cornell West.
I read that.
And yes, we went through that with
Yeah, we went
Political
through that.
Monday School. Something I'm thinking of starting back up again soon.
Great,
But
great book. Yeah.
Radical King, it's just a collection of Dr. King's more radical writings with a forward and with annotations by Dr. West. And more recently, I think it's important everyone who was going to bat for Joe Biden, he's not demented. I need you to read Jake Tapper's new book coming out about how the Democratic Party and the media apparatus lied about Biden's cognitive ability. Because Jake Tapper, who took part in that on NBC, is now releasing a book telling all about how the establishment knew that Biden wasn't there. And so that should be an interesting read.
All right, duly noted. I'll get those books. Well, thank you, David, for coming on my show. I'll be posting it to my podcast, India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and I'll be posting it to YouTube, Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement. I'd love to have you on again. I mean, we were in the People's Party together, and I learned a lot from you. So, and I think you continue to educate me. So, yeah, thank you for educating me.
Thank you for inviting me on, Sonny. I'm always happy to be in discussion with you. You teach me a lot, and your enthusiasm in organizing has always been an inspiration to me as well. Thank you, sir, for all you do.
Thank you.